colleagues and I are working hard to ensure the American people have a government by the people and for the people. We are working to restore the balance of powers that our forefathers put in place and to ensure that the executive overreach that was the hallmark of previous administrations will not be able to undermine transparency in the future. In that vein, the rule also provides for consideration of the Stop Settlements Slush Fund Act. The Stop Settlements Slush Funds Act prevents the Department of Justice from subverting Congress's power of the purse by prohibiting settlements that direct payments to a non-victim third party. Again, the misdirection of funds to irrelevant third parties is a problem that we've seen grow and that must be addressed. Under the previous administration, the Department of Justice funded non-victim third-party groups as much as $880 million. The Department of Justice did this by collecting money from parties who had broken the law and then using that money to create a slush fund for special interest groups rather than sending the money to victims of illicit activity. The Department of Justice allowed the donations required under the settlement to count as double credit against defendants' payment obligations. Let me rephrase that again. It said the Department of Justice allowed for the donations, quote, required under the settlements to count as double credit against the defendant's payment obligations. Interestingly, in some settlements under the previous administration, credit for direct relief to consumers was counted only as dollar for dollar, indicating the importance of the Department of Justice places on directing these funds to non-victim third parties. The Department of Justice policy move actually incentivized funneling money to non-victim groups rather than the people whom were injured. The slush fund scheme actually disadvantaged victims in favor of special interest. For example, the Department of Justice negotiated settlement agreements to the tune of millions of dollars with major banks for misleading investors over mortgage-backed securities. Then the Department of Justice said that banks or other parties it had settled with could meet some of their settlement obligations by making, again, donations to certain groups. The money went to these groups partially under the guise of that those groups would provide services to the aggrieved parties. In reality, the practice directs funds away from the victims and allows the Department of Justice to steer money to non-victim third-party groups, usually politically motivated organizations. Additionally, the parties that receive the funds, these non-victim third-party organizations, aren't a part of the case at all. This means that they don't represent the victims and aren't subject to congressional oversight for the funds they receive. Even if most of these groups weren't activist groups, which many were, this scenario should concern everyone, Mr. Speaker. In fact, many of these groups are politically or ideological in nature. Under the previous administration, in the mortgage settlement cases, groups like the National Council of La Raza received more than $1 million in Department of Housing and Urban Development grants under these settlements. I don't know about you, but I think when the DOJ requires a settlement, the funds should go to the victims involved in the case, including victims back home in Northeast Georgia. And if the victims cannot be found or the problem cannot be directly rectified, then the settlement funds should go to the Treasury so that Congress, elected by individual Americans, can appropriately decide how to use them. I don't think it is acceptable to shortchange victims to benefit special interests and political-friendly third-party organizations. It is time to reassert congressional authority over this process so that hardworking folks are protected from more executive overreach so that we can restore the separation of powers outlined in the Constitution. I am here fighting to make sure that the federal government puts the hardworking Georgians that I represent and the rest of the citizens of the United States, not special interest, first. These bills help ensure that the American citizens have their voices heard, that they regain input into the system, and that the federal government is more transparent, accountable, and responsive to their needs. I would encourage others who share that goal to support this rule and the underlying bills. And again, as you look ahead for this, the theme that I hopefully came out in this is that this is an Article 1 issue. This is simply about overtime that is given away from us in this body that we have done, but it's now time to reassess that, especially in light of the needs for the American people. And